in Australia, and there are some international people online, and so welcome to them as well, including our first keynote speaker. It's for him really quite late at night, so thank you very much indeed. I'll introduce Tom in just a few moments. But to all of you, welcome and thank you for joining us. We have my name is Richard Wilden. I'm Deputy Headmaster here on the academic side of the Anglican Church Grammar School in Brisbane, otherwise known as Churchy. And this is a really exciting event for us. And we're really looking forward to all of the ideas that we'll be talking around the science of learning and cognitive science that we'll be discussing today. And the title of our Teach Meet is, of course, a matter of translation. So we're going to be talking about translating the theory of the science of learning, which of course is robust when it comes to the benefits of dual coding and spacing, interleaving, retrieval practices, and so forth. But how to translate all of those things into the everyday experiences in the classroom. How to translate these things into study skills that students can then take from school into university and then into, hopefully, then into their own adult and professional lives more generally. So all of that's quite aspirational and terribly interesting. So it's just wonderful to have some space and some time to reflect on the research and to consider our different approaches to implementing these things as teachers, as school leaders, as researchers in universities, and so forth. In terms of basic organization for this morning, we will have the first two keynotes delivered on this Zoom link. So where you are right now is exactly where you should stay for the next hour or so. And after, you can see there at 10:10, there is a break. And at that point in time, that's where you start to move to the other sessions, to Keynote 3. Go back to the program. The first chat there in the chat forum is in fact the link to today's program. So if you don't have it on you, it's there in the chat area for you to click on. And from Keynote 3 into the workshops, you simply click on the relevant links according to that program to enter those keynotes and into those workshop sessions. So that should be pretty straightforward, and thank you for navigating that. Hopefully very easily. Any questions, of course, just ask them on the chat function. Now, we are blessed to be hosting the great continents of the world in some respects this morning. We're beaming across from the Antipodes, of course, but we have involvement from Europe, at least from the UK, and also from America. And talking of America, our second keynote speaker, Professor Mark McDaniel from Washington University. He is here in spirit. He was going to be here in person until just a couple of days ago, but he's here in spirit. He's been working with Churchy quite closely over the last few months, particularly in the area of trying to engender belief in what it is that we're doing in the area of cognitive science with our students, hoping that it works, thinking that it works, but then knowing and believing that it works. All of these are slightly different things, and he's been offering a really interesting framework for us to consider as part of all of that. And so, as I said before, Professor McDaniel, he's here in spirit today, but due to unexpected circumstances, he's not here in person, but very generously, he has sent his presentation to us, and he has sent his presentation notes to us. And our very own Dr. Terry Byers, who effectively set up today's Teach Meet and organized everything with our very own Vicky Layton, our Director of Staff Development and Research at Churchy. Terry will be reading through Professor McDaniel's presentation. And so we thank, in his absence, Professor McDaniel for his generosity, and of course to Terry and to Vicky for setting everything up and reading through what Professor McDaniel has offered us in that respect. We have workshops presented by a wonderful cast of teachers and researchers, and we thank them all for their generosity and for the time and the effort that they put into preparing things. We have Dr. Jack Leggett from the University of Queensland. We have presenters from the Lakes College, from Canterbury College, and of course from Churchy as well. And so a huge huge thank you to all of those presenters for their contribution. Our first keynote speaker is the wonderful Tom Perry, and Tom. Dr. Perry is, he's been cited far and wide, his research has, and by UK Parliamentary Briefing, by UNESCO, by the Young Lives International Study, by FFT Education Data Lab. He's been interviewed on BBC Radio 4, talking about the quite controversial move in the UK, where league tables a couple of years ago were replaced by a new metric called Progress 8. But today, he's here to talk about recent findings from the Education Endowment Foundation's Cognitive Science in the Classroom Review, which came out just earlier this year. We were just talking before the meeting started, and there's a big media item in the UK that we're expecting to see tomorrow on the issue of cognitive science in education. And so that's going to be very interesting. It's a very topical area. And Dr. Perry, it's just so wonderful to have you here. I'm going to throw over to you now. And so welcome. And so thank you. What time is it your end, Dr. Perry?
It's just gone midnight here, 10 past midnight. It's well past my bedtime is another way of saying that. And I'm really delighted to be here. This sounds like a fabulous event. And the one thing that's quite disappointing for me is I will be heading off to bed after this keynote. So I hope to hear more about things later. I've recently completed I'm just going to actually share my slides so we've got a visual here as well. I've recently completed a review with a large team at University of Birmingham, where I used to work, on cognitive science in the classroom. So this was a systematic review. We combined this with surveys, interviews, and a review of practice-facing guidance and literature. As a researcher, I was joined by a large and impressive team of cognitive scientists and neuroscientists and systematic review experts and education experts. Myself, my expertise is in using research and evidence. It's an applied research and evidence. My professional work is working with teachers and leaders to put research and evidence into practice. And this is why events such as this are, I think, so well placed to do that, to get that conversation going. And as a result, I'll summarize some of the review main points, but my focus today is going to be talking about how we might apply and translate theory and practice in cognitive science and get it working in the classroom. One of the key things within the review, where we put our central aim, was a desire to look at cognitive science in realistic settings. We knew there's a lot of lab-based work, there's a lot of basic science work that had been done, but what was less clear about 18 months ago was how much of this has actually been tried out in realistic classroom conditions. We wanted to know, does cognitive science work in real classrooms? Does it work across the curriculum? Does it work for different pupil groups, so different ages, and subgroups like disadvantaged children and young people, children with special educational needs? We wanted to know how these work out in practice. So one of the key distinctions we drew within the review was between the basic cognitive science and the applied cognitive science. When we look at basic cognitive science, the focus is on seeking fundamental understanding of learning, of memory, of the brain, and how these work. Basic science tends to use experiments in highly controlled conditions, sometimes in the laboratory, sometimes in controlled conditions in a classroom. And it looks to find fundamental theory and principles which will hopefully apply widely. Applied cognitive science, on the other hand, tends to take that theory and that fundamental understanding and looks to apply it in classroom conditions. So it often looks to find out not just whether something works, but where it works, for whom it works, in what conditions it works. And it tends to take a more realistic everyday classroom environment as its laboratory. So the basic cognitive science tries to identify the fundamentals, and the applied cognitive science tries to put those into realistic conditions. And it's the latter that we focused on in the review. As an overview, it was a very large review. We sifted and screened through over 40,000 research studies. I had a huge team working through this. It took many months to do this. We organized all of this into 8 overall cognitive science areas. And within these, we identified sub-strategies as well. I'm not going to assume everyone is familiar with these, but I assume quite a few of the terms on this slide here will be familiar to some of you. But just really briefly, if I just give a quick overview of some of these areas. So first, space learning. The idea behind space learning is that distributing learning over a period of time, over several lessons, over several weeks, or sometimes even spread out within a lesson, it tends to increase learning compared to massing it all together, blocking it all together in a single study session. So that's space learning. The second one, interleaving, is where we switch between different types of problem or different topics within the same study session. The third one, retrieval practice, is based on the idea that every time we retrieve something from our own memory, we recall it, it strengthens the strength of that memory. Linked to this is that over time, we gradually forget things we've been taught, and the implications for teachers is that we'll teach something, the students will know it in that lesson, and their memory of it will gradually fade over time. So we need to space out retrieval sessions to retain that memory and strengthen it over time. The fourth principle is around managing cognitive load. We know that the working memory, the amount of information we can deal with at once is very limited. The long-term memory is, for all intents and purposes, unlimited, infinite, but the working memory is a real bottleneck. So teachers have to think very carefully about how much information they present to students at once, how it's presented, and how much of that information is novel. So these are some of the key ideas we started out to review. There are some other theories in here which came out of some of the papers we had here. So we originally set out to look at dual coding, but we then placed that within number 6, the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. So dual coding is where you present a visual along with verbal information. We had another section on working with schemas where we looked at how people generate, edit their schemas, how they compare and contrast concepts. And we had a section on embodied learning as well, looking at things like gestures, tracing, embodiment, and then acting learning as a way of improving our memory and recall of it. And finally, we had some mixed strategy programs. So it's a wide-ranging review. It covers 8 areas, 14 strategies in total. And in each one, we did a systematic evidence review where we looked at all classroom trials and summarized their effectiveness. And we also presented extended, what we called evidence-informed discussion and questions, where we talked about some of the theory and the principles. And here we included lots of teacher perspectives on how they tried to put cognitive science into the classroom. So that's an overview of the review. If I come to the headline findings, and then I'm going to move on to talk about some of the things that you can do to think about application and translation. So our key findings, number 1, is that cognitive science matters. We had very clear evidence that the principles behind cognitive science resulted in greater amounts of learning when put against comparable controls. The cognitive science principles explained variation in the learning between different groups within trials, and they worked in in not all areas, because we didn't have the evidence for it, but they tended to work in a wide variety of settings. So the idea that cognitive science is a depiction of sort of fundamental learning science, I think is accurate. Some people will say that cognitive science, is it another educational fad? Is it a fashion? Is it going to come and go? We think not. We think there's enough evidence here to back it, and we recommend that teachers learn working principles of cognitive science, and it's embedded within training and professional development. At the same time, we found the applied evidence to be far more limited, far more complex, and far less positive than most of the basic science. So there's a huge amount of basic science which supports these principles, but when it comes to things being put into practice, not only is there less evidence there, but that evidence is less unambiguously positive. We had many negative results, we had many null results, we had some complex findings which are suggesting that translation is hard and that basic science does not always work in an everyday classroom conditions. In particular, we found some particular gaps for subject areas. Much of the basic science is not concerned with subject specificity. It looks at learning more in general, and a lot of it is focused on subjects such as maths and science. When we look outside at maths and science, at subjects like art or English, we found fewer studies and more difficulties in making claims based on the evidence we had. The other thing is the applied research surfaced many additional theoretical and practical problems with putting cognitive science into practice. A few of those I'm going to touch on in just a moment. So I've now, just to say this slide here, I put some links onto the main report. We have a very large, I think it's 300-page report. We have a summary report produced by the Education Endowment Foundation for us. There's a preview talk, about an hour of me talking about the main findings, Twitter summary thread. If you want to find out more about our main report, this is the place to go, and I'll share these slides afterwards, and you'll find it on a pinned tweet on my Twitter account. So I'm going to devote the time I have now to talk about the application, and in some cases the misapplication of cognitive science in the classroom, and what we think we can learn from the applied evidence that we have. I'm going to start with some more general points about application of evidence. So one of the things which is often lost within the research is the element of professional development and learning, that often the research was set up almost to teacher-proof the studies. There were scripted lessons or researchers delivering the interventions themselves, cutting out the important middle step of teaching teachers the principles of cognitive science in order to get it into practice. This middle step of applying it was often cut out to make for a more tightly controlled experiment. And this is frustrating from a applied researcher's point of view. But I think it was clear from what we did have that CPD is incredibly important for the application. What you have in front of you is a list of principles for effective professional development and learning. I'm not going to go over them. There's again a couple of links there, but things like we wouldn't expect cognitive science to be applied immediately overnight. Number 7, we expect to see teacher practice changing gradually over time. There's usually a rhythm of activities spread out over 6 months, 12 months, or even longer. It takes time to change teachers' practice. Just to pick out another one, number 1, pupil orientation. Good CPD tends to be focused on what pupils are thinking, what pupils are learning, what pupils are experiencing, and how we present our curriculum, how we present and teach affects what pupils do. There's a set of principles here which I think are really important. So any good attempt to apply cognitive science should be thinking carefully about CPD. Another general point to make about application is there's a large amount of overlap between the principles and a large number of connections between them. And this is between the cognitive science principles, but also with cognitive science and more general pedagogical, practical principles. So let me give you a few examples of that. When we start spacing out learning content over time, over days or weeks, we tend to almost automatically build in an element of retrieval. Teachers are often recapping, but sometimes students are recalling their content which they learned in the previous lesson or the previous week. We often, when we space out practice, tend to introduce an element of retrieval. We see with interleaving, by design, we're building space practice in. If you go from topic A to topic B to topic A to topic B, you've automatically spaced out topic A with the B gaps in between, and same with the B. So you've built retrieval practice and often spacing as well, all within the same strategy. We can see other examples that where teachers offer worked examples, but they leave gaps. They leave a fill in the gaps test with those. They're building in retrieval at the same time as worked examples. We see links, strong links between dual coding, when done right, seems to not increase cognitive load, but increase the amount of information as we dual code between both verbal and visual information. Done badly, cognitive load is increased by dual coding, and I'll come back to that. So there's several examples where we can link cognitive science principles together. I'd also add that when we start thinking about how these work in practice, we start coming back to things like feedback, questioning, metacognition, things which are the central to teachers' practice and thinking, teachers' subject knowledge, even down to practicalities like workload and planning. Thinking through how cognitive science works involves connecting it with everything else we know as educators and everything else we do practically and pedagogically, as well as key links to our particular groups that we teach and our subjects that we teach. So another general point about applying cognitive science is that you're, as a teacher, working from general to specific. Researchers tend to go the other way. They take specific practices and they try and generalize and look at whether something works across a large number of settings. Teachers are working in the other direction and taking a general principle and trying to figure out what it looks like in a specific circumstance. And when we look at that at the level of principles, we can say something like, the basic science tells us retrieval works, so recalling information strengthens memory. And as we get more specific, well, why don't we do that deliberately and practice it? Retrieval practice works, and we know this again from the basic science. But then we can ask, well, does it work in different subjects? Does it work in different age ranges? Does it work with different teaching and learning activities? There are lots of ways of getting students to recall and retrieve information. We could ask them to write down everything on the top of their head on a blank sheet of paper. We could give them fill in the gaps passages. We could do quizzes. We could do multiple choice quizzes. Which of these specific activities is the best one to use? We can think about specific learning objectives or types of content. We can think about specific conditions like teacher experience and expertise. We can think about the prior knowledge of pupils in the topic area, pupil motivation, right down to, yes, my year 4 maths lesson on fractions on Tuesday morning, all maths groups, with maybe me supporting one of the groups with their work. Teachers have to get from a general principle, 1 or 2 or 3 sometimes, all the way down to 7 to make things work into practice. But the basic science tends to be located at 1 and 2, and the applied science doesn't get too much further down. There's a lot of thought and work needed to do to bridge that gap. So what is the best way of bridging that gap? I think my central answer to this would be around getting principles clear and working hard to experiment and develop to put those principles into practice. I think hanging on to the principles and thinking through how they work in a given context, I think that's the key single piece of advice about how to bridge that gap. So let me give you an example here with retrieval practice. So here are some of the principles behind it. First, that we know that people gradually forget things over time. This is the famous Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. You can see from the blue line that on the first presentation, students gradually forget something over time. And as you keep repeating it, you refresh the memory of it, and then it falls again. But crucially, those lines are getting higher and higher. So we've got this forgetting and retrieval to refresh principle. Another principle would be specifically the principle of retrieval versus restudy. Retrieval practice is found to be more effective than restudy or representation. There are studies which find that it's the act of recalling something from our own memory without having it in front of us is the thing that really strengthens our memory, as opposed to rereading it. So when they put students who reread a passage as part of revision, and those who do some kind of quiz where they have to come up with the answer and then check their answer, it's the latter that tends to do far better. It's not just refreshing the information, it's retrieving it that has the real power within it. Another principle would be that most subjects are areas of knowledge are organized schematically. There's more central and more distal ideas. In this visual I've got here, this blue node in the middle, this is the most important piece of information to hold together this topic. Teachers need to identify, using their subject knowledge, which the key foundational ideas, what are the threshold ideas within their subject area. They're the things that should be focused on for retrieval and ensuring students have really strong knowledge within them. And a final principle here would be that we know that accuracy of retrieval, so when students successfully manage to come up with the answer, tends to be favourable for improving learning, and where students are they're retrieving misconceptions, that's problematic. And I'll talk in a moment about linking that to feedback. So just those 4 principles there, and we could have spent a bit longer on that. It's knowing those principles really well and then doing the hard work of thinking through what that looks like in any given learning context. That is the trick, I think, to successful translation of cognitive science. I think there's quite a lot of thinking and practice to do there. I believe I've got about 5 minutes. I'm just going to pick out some selected findings, selected examples of challenges and things to think about within the evidence that we have. Just to say, I mean, over the coming months, this is still a fairly fresh report. I hope to publish more on this, and I can share briefings and information on this. So this is a bit of a quick dash through a few things, but here are a few things I think are worth thinking about when applying cognitive science in different areas. So looking at spaced learning, I think one of the key things teachers told us was around the difficulties of timetabling. It was a timetabling practical problem. They saw it as much as anything else. How do they do planning? How do they work with central timetabling if they have it? To do spacing. Some teachers said, I already do spacing because my lessons are spread out every day or every week, so I have to space just to get my curriculum covered. I can't do it as a block. There was a distinction between spaced learning and spaced practice. A lot of teachers are doing spaced practice, like quizzing or retrieval practice, but it seems the evidence is wider, and you can spread out a topic over time. And where that happens, teachers need to be able to use effective recaps, effective assessment, to be able to pick up where you left off and to spread out content over time. In interleaving, teachers tended to report that it was incredibly difficult to understand the principles behind it. The key principles behind interleaving were around getting 2 ideas, so it's A-B, A-B, and these being complementary in some way, they're contrasting, and the key trick was to be able to differentiate the 2 things. So a really good example from the review was that teachers, when they're teaching maths, they found that mixing up addition and subtraction problems within the same worksheet, for example, this is a good example of interleaving 2 problem types, which helps students differentiate between the 2 strategies. as I say, you've also, when you're interleaving, got retrieval practice in there. So these seem like the principles, but teachers talk to us and they said, I've got a quote here, someone said, I don't think anyone I work with, including myself, knows how to use this properly. Another said, I can't get my head around how to make this work. I think this is reflected in our review, where we had a large number of, we had negative results in interleaving in the basic science and more generally. I think it is a tricky thing. It's hard to know what to interleave. It definitely seems there's strong evidence it works in maths. Outside of that, I think there's some good thinking needed to see what's worth interleaving in English or in art or in history. Right, I'm aware I've only got a couple of minutes left, so just a couple of final points from me here. One of the key things around retrieval practice, I think retrieval practice was an area which was incredibly fundamental, had strong evidence in basic science, but unfortunately there were too few studies in the applied evidence. But I think it's a very strong strategy when you look at the overall picture of those. But one thing that did come up as an important thing to think about is how we couple retrieval practice, like a daily quiz, for example, with feedback and formative assessment. Setting the difficulty of our retrieval quizzes and ensuring that they're not embedding misconceptions is really important. There were quite a few studies where teachers gave immediate feedback, or they looked to reteach concepts or correct misconceptions. There was also a motivational effect of this. It seemed that students getting quick feedback, they found incredibly motivational for further learning. So I think coupling feedback and retrieval practice did come out as an important one. And finally, one of the things that seemed harder to do within retrieval practice was what we might call higher order or more complex or more higher element interactivity. It's sometimes called content. Retrieval practice, there's really firm evidence that it's good for building up factual knowledge and remembering foundational content. The evidence, though, on using it for more nuanced, more complex ideas, it seemed to be more mixed. It seemed that some teachers were able to construct multiple choice quizzes, for example, in a way that teased out complexity, but it seemed a harder thing to do. Okay, so as I say, I mean, I'm going to continue publishing and communicating about some of these things over the coming weeks and months. So, I mean, I hope to continue the conversation here. But if I could just close with a few quotations from some teachers from a slightly different research study. The first one is around this idea, lost in translation, I've said. And there's a lovely quotation from a school leader who said, I suppose the risk is that the purity of the research becomes slightly distorted the further it goes into different areas of the school. You might go into art and find something you said about retrieval practice looks completely different. And suddenly you're not 100% sure whether it's even the same thing anymore. We had a lot of that from teachers. It's sometimes really hard to know whether you're meeting those principles. I may have simplified my discussion of retrieval there, but when you actually look at it in practice, it's sometimes hard to know whether those principles are being met. I think that's a real challenge, and having conversations as educators about what good looks like, I think is really important. There's another point here about knowing something and doing it are very different. There's a lot of work ahead of you. Even once you know those principles, it takes time to change practice. And my final point is that I think this is maybe perhaps more for the English audience, where policymakers are putting cognitive science into strategy, and there's a tension between teachers' autonomy and a sort of top-down imposition of principles of effective learning. I think teachers always need to retain ownership or autonomy of the strategies they use, and I think that's certainly the case with cognitive science in its current state of understanding. I'm going to stop there. Honestly, it's been a pleasure to be here. You can follow me on Twitter. You can email me once I have my new email address from my new workplace, and I'm happy to take any questions if there is any time at the moment.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. We do have a chat forum, so if anyone would like to take Tom up on that opportunity to ask any questions, then please do so before we let you go to sleep, Tom. I really love that idea of the central concepts or the threshold. I think you referred to them as threshold ideas, which requires obviously quite a lot of synthesis on behalf of the teacher. And I guess they're trigger ideas, right? They're ideas that lead on to other concepts within each of our units, within each of our programs.
Some of the teachers told us that they had huge banks of questions across their subject, but they did the maths of, if they ask 5 quick retrieval quizzes every day, they realized it would take them 3 years to get through all the. So they were talking about how they thought about the key ideas in their subject and how to focus in on those. And I thought that was it's a very subject specific thing, but I think it's important.
Yeah, really interesting thing. Is there any research in terms of how to, I guess, draw attention to those threshold concepts? Is it, visibly sort of presenting them differently? Is it putting them at the beginning of the class as opposed to at the end of the class? Is it, how many threshold concepts for a particular 6-week topic do you think would be appropriate?
I would, a lot of teachers in England at least are using something they call a knowledge organizer. They're trying to put on almost a single page of A4, almost the revision sheet overview of the module. I'm not going to come to numbers, but teachers are finding that really useful to give students almost like a schematic overview of the topic they're going to cover, and then they keep returning back to that. We did find some evidence that it's not having these things like a knowledge organization that matters, it's how students engage with them that seem to matter. Teachers are using these as effective maps, if you like, to what students had to learn. As I say, I do think there's a lot of very specialist subject expertise in there, but I think there is a valuable strategy too.
We've got a question from Jack Leggett from the University of Queensland, which is just wonderful. His question, Tom, I'll just read it out to you, is what finding from the review was most surprising to you? He thanks you for the talk, very interesting as well, but were there any surprising elements of the review that you didn't anticipate, perhaps?
I was surprised by some of the evidence on dual coding. I think I had come to it feeling I felt quite confident about what it was and how it worked. And I find quite early on that I thought I was presenting verbal information and visual information, and it's very clear. But what students tend to do is, if they read the word cat, they often visualize a cat, or they see a picture of a cat, they can verbalize the word cat. So even if you present students with an image, sometimes they verbalize it, and sometimes you give them words and they visualize it. So all bets are off when you're giving verbal. I think I'm controlling, this dual coded verbal and visual message, but actually students across the class are getting very different information. As you start to dig, you find that images have informational content, more or less. Some are decorative, some are schematic, some are informative. You have a transient information effect when you're talking. You're constantly losing, you're having to play things in a loop to keep them in your mind while visuals stay there. Dual coding was the surprise for me, mainly the surprise about my own ignorance about how it worked. I think it's quite complex, and I think the results reflected that as well. I think there's a lot of ways to get it wrong as well as right, I think.
Maybe just one last question, Tom, if that's okay, and apologies to those who have asked questions, but there are lots of people here who know a lot of things, so feel free, Terry, Vicky, and Alex and others, to respond to various people in the chat forum there with any ideas, impressions, and so forth that you have to facilitate those online written conversations. But one here, Tom, which I thought was kind of interesting, is there any current teaching practice that actually runs counter to the cognitive science principles that you've been talking about for the last half hour or so?
What we found within the review was that where there were negative results, they were often explainable, even through the cognitive science. Some of the big ones which were explainable but negative were things around what we call expert reversal effects. So sometimes we find, so this is in managing cognitive load, if you have a relative novice in a complex problem or a complex learning area, you should give very direct instruction, you should give them worked examples, you should give them really clear scaffolds and guidance. But what happens is that learner starts to gain expertise, they start to learn the topic area, and it starts to get to the point where that guidance, those scaffolds, that worked examples start to be detrimental. They stop needing them and it starts to be harmful for their learning as they develop expertise. So you have this, novices need this and experts need this, and a transition between the two of them. So where we had practices which were counter, I think, to the results, a cognitive scientist would say, well, actually, that's within the theory. We would expect the negative result there because it was an inappropriate use of a worked example or a scaffold. I think the tricky thing for educators, of course, is knowing where one finishes. Where's the novice leave off and the expert pick up? At what point are our students within this learning journey? I think almost all the strategies came with a caveat. They work here in these conditions for these learners in these contexts. And I think that's where we saw things which were negative, that they've been applied too simplistically, essentially.
Tom, you've been enormously generous, wonderfully insightful. Thank you so much. You're very welcome to stay, of course, but we understand it's incredibly late, so there's certainly no pressure there. But it's going to be great to stay in touch a little bit over the next little bit of time, and good luck with the new job and with all of that research that is already underway.
Thank you so much for having me. I do hope to catch up and find out what's been going on the rest of the day. It's a shame I'm not there and able to join you. I do mean, I will send on my email address to you, Richard, and Terry. I'll make myself contactable. If people have questions and they want to continue a conversation, that's exactly what I do and love, and that's my day job. So do get in touch or tweet me, and it'll be good to continue what I think is a really important conversation. If I could just return to our first finding that cognitive science matters, I think we know a lot about the basic science. I think our translation application of it at the moment, we have a lot as a profession, as educators, to work through. So these kind of conversations, I think, are vital for that. So good luck with it, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. Look, we're just running a little bit over time, but for very good